joining me today. We're going to be continuing and finishing up our study of Amos this week. So let's go ahead and pray as we get started. God, thank you so much for today, and thank you for the opportunity to read your word together. I pray that as we do that, you will speak to our hearts, that you will teach us something and transform us, God. We love you, and we pray all this in your holy and precious name. Amen. So we are going to wrap up our study of Amos today. We're going to be taking a look at Amos 7 through Amos 9. We have spent the last several weeks walking through all of the different parts of this book of prophecy. And we're going to look, because the end of this book is a little different than the way it started. So starting here in chapter 7, Amos is going to have a series of visions. There are 5 visions spread out across the 3 chapters. The first 3 come in rapid fire in chapter 7 at the very beginning, and then there's a vision at the beginning of chapter 8 and a vision at the beginning of chapter 9. And there's some things breaking up the first 3 from the other 2, and we'll talk a little bit about all that. And then we're going to zero in, after we talk about the visions, we're going to zero in on chapter 9, the last part of it. And the book is going to end on a little bit different note than it's been the rest of the time, because the message of Amos so far has been lots and lots of doom and destruction, and the judgment is coming. But it doesn't end that way. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So Amos 7 starts with the first 3, but really the first 4 visions contain a lot of similarities, and the 5th vision is a little bit different than the others. So let's go ahead and talk about these first 3 in chapter 7. I'm going to go ahead and read Amos 7, 1 through 9. This is what the sovereign Lord showed me. He was preparing swarms of locusts after the king's share had been harvested, and just as the late crops were coming up, when they had stripped the land clean, I cried out, "Sovereign Lord, forgive! How can Jacob survive? He is so small." So the Lord relented. "This will not happen," the Lord said. "This is what the sovereign Lord showed me. The sovereign Lord was calling for judgment by fire. It dried up the great deep and devoured the land. Then I cried out, 'Sovereign Lord, I beg you, stop! How can Jacob survive? He is so small.' So the Lord relented. 'This will not happen either,' the sovereign Lord said. This is what he showed me. The Lord was standing by a wall that had been built true to plumb, with a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord asked me, 'What do you see, Amos?' 'A plumb line,' I replied. Then the Lord said, 'Look, I am setting a plumb line among my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. The high places of Isaac will be destroyed, and the sanctuaries of Israel will be ruined. And with my sword I will rise against the house of Jeroboam.'" So these first 3 visions and the 4th one in general follow a very similar pattern. There is a statement about in a report by Amos about what God shows him. And then what follows is a conversation between Amos and God, and then a pronouncement from God about the significance of this vision. It starts with, "This is what God has shown me. He was preparing swarms of locusts." So the what is the swarms of locusts coming to eat the crops, the late crops. And this plague, so basically it's a locust plague, and this plague would have been coming after the first fruits had already been taken, and the late crop was about to sprout, and this would have been completely devastating, as any type of locust plague would have been. And one of the things that would have been particularly devastating, and that the commentary I was reading this week pointed it out, is that they didn't have like seed storage where they could or go to the store and get more seed if this didn't work out. So all of it would have been planted, and so there wouldn't have really been any way to recover, not an easy way to recover from such a plague. So that's all we find in verse 1. And then in verse 2, we see Amos crying out, "Sovereign Lord, forgive. How can Jacob survive? He is so small." And then God responds by relenting. "This will not happen." And we see a similar pattern again in the second vision. This time the vision is a judgment by fire. So essentially some sort of a shower or raining down of fire that was going to dry up the great deep. and devour the land. So by the great deep, Amos is meaning, really it's all the wells and the springs were just completely drying up. There is this general idea of like the gathering of the waters by God that would then water the land. And so the idea is that all of this water that existed was going to be dried up, and then the land was going to be devoured by fire. And so once again, Amos cries out, begs the Lord to stop. How can Jacob survive? He is so small, and the Lord relents. But then the third vision, it starts off with a similar pattern. This is what the Lord showed me. And this time it's a wall that has been built, says true to plumb. And he sees the Lord standing there and he's holding a plumb line. But then this is where the pattern changes. And it says, and the Lord asked me, what do you see, Amos? And we'll see this pattern again with the fourth vision. And we'll get to that one in just a minute. It says, what do you see, Amos? And he responds, a plumb line. And then the Lord gives the pronouncement that he's setting a plumb line among my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. And then he pronounces the judgment and destruction that is to come. So let's go ahead and skip ahead to chapter 8. And let's look at the first vision in that chapter, because there are some similarities between visions 3 and 4. Just like visions 1 and 2 were very similar. Visions 3 and 4 are also very similar. So this is what the sovereign Lord showed me. So this is Amos 8, 1 through 4. This is what the sovereign Lord showed me. A basket of ripe fruit. What do you see, Amos? He asked. A basket of ripe fruit, I answered. Then the Lord said to me, the time is ripe for my people Israel. I will spare them no longer. And that day, declares the sovereign Lord, the songs in the temple were turned to wailing. Many, many bodies flung everywhere. Silence. So we see in this fourth vision, God once again asking Amos, what do you see? So it starts the same. This is what the Lord showed me. Then what do you see? And Amos responds. So in the first two visions, we have a vision of a plague of locusts and a rain of fire, some sort of fire that's devouring the land. Both of those things would have been immediately recognized by Amos as an ominous sight, something that was terrible, a plague of locusts. Nobody wants that. We definitely don't want fire raining down from the sky either. Those things are going to seem particularly and obviously terrible. But when we get to the third vision, we have this vision of a plumb line, a wall and a plumb line. And then in the fourth vision, a basket of ripe fruit or of summer fruit. Some of the translations say summer fruit. The idea there would be that this was a desirable thing. Who doesn't want a basket of ripe fruit, of summer fruit? So summer fruit in that area would have been pomegranates and melons and grapes and figs, other fruits like that, and it would have been something desirable. It didn't initially seem bad, just like a wall that has been measured with a plumb line. That doesn't seem initially terrible either. But both visions 3 and 4, this initial vision, while the vision itself didn't seem bad or terrible or ominous in any way, immediately turns and God uses that vision to speak further about the coming judgment of Israel and how it is inevitable and there is no escape from it. The other thing that we notice about visions 3 and 4 is that there is no response from Amos asking the Lord to relent. In the first two, Amos intercedes on behalf of Israel and says, how can Jacob survive? Forgive, sovereign Lord, forgive. How can Jacob survive? And then down in verse 5, I beg you stop. How can Jacob survive? He is so small. And both times the Lord relents. So at Amos's request, God relents from these punishments that are coming, the plague of locusts and the rain of fire. And the commentary I read this week, he pointed out that this was God relenting based on God's compassion. So God's love and compassion and God's mercy moved him to relent from these two actions. So this plague of locusts and this rain of fire. But then we see in visions 3 and 4 there is no interceding by Amos. And God's saying, but there is going to be destruction and judgment to come based on what has been happening. And so we see in the third vision about the high places being destroyed, and the sword, he's going to raise his sword against the house of Jeroboam. And then in chapter 8, that he says the songs in the temple will turn to wailing. There's going to be many bodies flung everywhere, and then it ends with silence. So as if, hey, there's nothing else you can say. Amos, don't even begin to intercede here. So those are the first 4 visions. And we'll get to the 5th vision in a few minutes once we talk about a few of these pieces in between them. Because the 5th vision is very different than these first 4. So I want to back up just a little bit and look at this section from Amos 7, starting in verse 10, all the way through the end of chapter 7. Because we get a little bit more of Amos's story, and we also get a little bit of how his message is being received. So I'm going to read this section and we're going to talk about it for a bit. Amos 7, starting in verse 10. Then Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, sent a message to Jeroboam, king of Israel. Amos is raising a conspiracy against you in the very heart of Israel. The land cannot bear all his words, for this is what Amos is saying. Jeroboam will die by the sword, and Israel will surely go into exile away from their native land. Then Amaziah said to Amos, get out, you seer, go back to the land of Judah, earn your bread there, and do your prophesying there. Don't prophesy any more at Bethel, because this is the king's sanctuary and the temple of the kingdom. Amos answered Amaziah, I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I was a shepherd, and I also took care of sycamore fig trees. But the Lord took me from tending the flock and said to me, go, prophesy to my people Israel. Now then, hear the word of the Lord. You say, do not prophesy against Israel and stop preaching against the descendants of Isaac. Therefore, this is what the Lord says. Your wife will become a prostitute in the city, and your sons and daughters will fall by the sword. Your land will be measured and divided up, and you yourself will die in a pagan country, and Israel will surely go into exile away from their native land. So in this section, we meet Amaziah, who was the priest of Bethel, and perhaps a chief priest of Bethel. And he is really upset about Amos's message that he's been preaching, and he accuses Amos of treason and writes a message or sends a message to Jeroboam. So this is Jeroboam II. So if we were to look back at very beginning of Amos, that's where we were situated in the time period. Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, and it was also he was a contemporary of Uzziah and Judah. So this would be the second Jeroboam, and he accuses Amos of conspiracy and treason. And then Amaziah takes it upon himself to attempt to banish Amos back to Judah. Says, get out of here, go back to the land of Judah. And then he says, earn your bread there and do your prophesying there. So Amaziah is at least implying here that Amos is getting paid for his prophecy. And he says, don't prophesy here anymore. And this is the king's sanctuary and the temple of the kingdom. He doesn't even say this is the temple of the Lord or anything of that nature. It's the temple of the kingdom, and it belongs to the king. And so then what follows that is Amos will give a defense. And so his defense gives us a little bit more information about him. So we learn here that Amos was not a prophet, nor was he the son of a prophet. It says that he was a shepherd. So not a prophet and then not a son of a prophet mean that he was not like Elisha was to Elijah. He was not like a disciple or a follower of a prophet most likely that's what it means. It was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I was a shepherd and I also took care of sycamore fig trees. And a lot of scholars say, and I think it's interesting, that this phrase right here talking about being a shepherd and taking care of fig trees kind of implies that he wasn't just a laborer, but he was perhaps a landowner. So he had means and at least enough to have a flock and to have an orchard. And I think it's very interesting because in some ways Amos is pushing back on, he's not doing this for money. He is doing this because the Lord has called him to. Go from here and go to Israel and prophesy to the people there. And so he's pushing it back and saying, like, no, this is what God has sent me to do. God is the one who sent me. I'm not doing this because it's my job or money. Amos is essentially saying, this is not my profession. My profession is a shepherd and a tender of trees, as one commentator put it. But, and so essentially here, Amaziah and the people of Israel are rejecting God's prophet. They're rejecting the message that God has given to Amos, and they're rejecting Amos himself. And we know from our reading of 1st and 2nd Kings, it's not a good idea to reject the Lord's message and also to reject his prophet. We've seen that, and we've studied Ezekiel, we've studied Isaiah, all sorts of things. You better listen if there's a prophet. That's one of the things that we see in the Old Testament, for sure. And so then Amos responds and says, you want me to stop prophesying, but in fact, and then he gives this very not mincing words, rebuke and judgment against, a judgment oracle against Amaziah himself. It says that he's going to die in a pagan country and that his wife will become a prostitute in the city and all of his children will die by the sword. So that is not a very pretty picture. So that little prophetic narrative falls in between the first 3 visions and the 4th vision at the beginning of chapter 8. And then what follows in chapter 8 after the 4th vision is really just more messages about the coming destruction and about how the people are going to be held accountable. So it starts very similar to what we have seen, similarly to what we have seen previously in Amos. Hear this is 8:4. Hear this, you who trample the needy and do away with the poor of the land. So, hey, listen, these people, and then fill in the blank. Listen, these people who trample the needy and do all of those things. And then he gives a message to them. And it just reminds them that they're going to be held accountable and that that there's going to be suffering in the aftermath of the destruction. And then I wanted to draw your attention real quickly to the verses 11 and 12. So this is very interesting phrasing here. It says, the days are coming, declares the sovereign Lord, when I will send a famine through the land, not a famine of food or a thirst for water, but a famine of hearing the words of the Lord. People will stagger from sea to sea and wander from north to east, searching for the word of the Lord, but they will not find it. So Amos says that in the aftermath of this judgment and destruction that comes, there's going to be a famine of hearing the word of the Lord. So no one is going to be able to hear the word of the Lord. And it will be a famine. They'll be wandering around searching for it, but they will not find it. What a bleak picture. I mean, this to me, these verses kind of sum up a lot of what we've seen in Amos. Lots of destruction, lots of not the most happy pictures, lots of bleakness. There's lots of destruction, and people are going to be held accountable for their actions. But then we get to chapter 9, and we get to the 5th vision, and then we end on a little bit different note. So let's take a look at this 5th vision, because it's very different from the others. So I'm going to read it. It's 9:1 through 4. I saw the Lord standing by the altar, and he said, strike the tops of the pillars so that the thresholds shake. Bring them down on the heads of all the people. Those who are left I will kill with the sword. Not one will get away. None will escape. Though they dig down to the depths below, from there my hand will take them. Though they climb up to the heavens above, from there I will bring them down. Though they hide themselves on the top of Carmel, there I will hunt them down and seize them. Though they hide from my eyes at the bottom of the sea, there I will command the serpent to bite them. Though they are driven into exile by their enemies, there I will command the sword to slay them. I will keep my eye on them for harm and not good. So a very different vision. This time Amos sees the Lord standing by the altar, and then he hears the Lord say this message of destruction. And Amos watches, kind of has like a front row seat to see what's going to happen. He sees this temple being destroyed and the people being destroyed and them trying to escape but not being able to. So this picture of the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel is bleak, it's terrible, and it's inescapable. It continues to bring up this theme of the inevitability of the coming judgment and destruction. And the people are going to be held accountable. It's inevitable that they're going to be held accountable. And then what follows this vision is another doxology section in verses 5 and 6. And we're going to see similar themes to the ones we've already talked about in chapter 4 and chapter 5. And we see this emphasis on God as creator. So let's go ahead and read verses 5 and 6, and then we'll mention a few things. The Lord Almighty, he touches the earth and it melts, and all who live in it mourn. The whole land rises like the Nile, then sinks like the river of Egypt. He builds his lofty palace in the heavens and sets its foundation on the earth. He calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out over the face of the land. The Lord is his name. So as I said, we see images here emphasizing God as creator, but also God, the God who creates, can also get rid of what he created. So basically it's affirming God's power over creation. So he touches the earth and it melts, and all who live in it mourn. The land can rise like the Nile and sink, rise and sink like the Nile rises. And then then Amos talks about how the waters, God can call the waters of the sea to pour out over the face of the land. Really, it's a message kind of underscoring and emphasizing this judgment, this coming judgment of Israel. But definitely in different language than what we've just read. It's a lot more similar to the doxology we saw at the end of chapter 4 in verse 13, or in 5, 8, and 9. We talked about God creating. So this God, this is the one who is coming, who is going to judge and enact this judgment. And this brings us to the last section of Amos in chapter 9. I'm going to start reading in verse 7. I'm just going to read to the end, and then we're going to talk about some of these verses. Are not you, Israelites, the same to me as the Cushites, declares the Lord? Did I not bring Israel up from Egypt, the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir? Surely the eyes of the sovereign Lord are on the sinful kingdom. I will destroy it from the face of the earth. Yet I will not totally destroy the descendants of Jacob, declares the Lord. For I will give the command, and I will shake the people of Israel among all the nations, as grain is shaken in a sieve. Not a pebble will reach the ground. All the sinners among my people will die by the sword. All those who say disaster will not overtake or meet us. In that day, I will restore David's fallen shelter. I will repair its broken walls and restore its ruins, and will rebuild it as it used to be, so that they may possess the remnant of Edom and all the nations that bear my name, declares the Lord, who will do these things. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when the reaper will be overtaken by the plowman and the planter by the one treading grapes. New wine will drip from the mountains and flow from all the hills, and I will bring my people Israel back from exile. They will rebuild the ruined cities and live in them. They will plant vineyards and drink their wine. They will make gardens and eat their fruit. I will plant Israel in their own land, never again to be uprooted from the land I have given them, says the Lord your God. So finally, we get a message of hope. It's a brief one, but it's there. A message of hope of a remnant being preserved and God restoring the land. But I think it's interesting how it starts here in verse 7. And we almost hear God pushing back against these people who were saying, well, we're God's chosen people, so nothing bad can happen to us because we are chosen. But God's saying, yes, I delivered you out of Egypt, but I also delivered the Philistines and the Syrians. And I think it's very interesting. And he also mentions the Cushites. And that could be people from modern day Ethiopia, like that kind of part of the world. So we have these foreign nations mentioned. And it's very interesting because God's essentially saying, like, I'm at work in these places. I have worked on behalf of those people. It's not confined to Israel. God's work is not confined to Israel. So from that point in verse 7, we move on to a message of the eyes of the Lord being on the sinful kingdom to be destroyed from the face of the earth. And so we have this message of destruction in the first part of verse 8. But the second part of verse 8 says, yet I will not totally destroy the descendants of Jacob. So in this one verse, it's very paradoxical. On the one hand, the destruction is going to be, the sinful kingdom will be destroyed, like wiped from the face of the earth is the image I get in my mind, but yet I will not totally destroy the descendants of Jacob. And perhaps this is alluding to the remnant that will come back after the Babylonian exile with Judah. But regardless, what an interesting paradox in one little verse. Some will survive, even though there's going to be this destruction of wiping the nation off the face of the earth. And then we get an image of a sieve, which I thought is particularly interesting. And they're going to be shaken among all the nations, and that the sinners from his people will die by the sword. All of those who disaster will not overtake or meet us. This idea that this sieve is going to be shaken and nothing is going to fall to the ground. So this image of the sieve shaking the people of Israel. And there's this image that some will survive, but all of the others are going to be scattered. They're not going to be one place. But yet, and verse 11 is where we really get this turn in a very much more obvious way. In that day, I will restore David's kingdom. So this image of restoring the kingdom of David and repairing its walls and repossessing land that used to be a part of it. This would be Edom, and it says all the nations that bear my name. But then I think it's very interesting because then it ends with this, not just this note of, okay, we're going to rebuild this nation, the kingdom of David, but there's also hope that the land will be fertile again, very fertile. That so much so that if we look in verse 13, those who are harvesting are going to be still harvesting when it's time to replant, because the harvest is just going to be so bountiful. And so it's very interesting as we read this. And so it's not just hope that it's going to be fertile again, but this hope for this overabundance of harvest and fruitfulness that is going to come. So this repopulation, this rebuilding, complete abundance at God's restoration of Israel. And so at the end, the very end of a book that has been filled with lots of bleak pictures and lots of destruction, what a message of hope for Amos to end with. It's a reminder that this story isn't over. So yes, judgment is inevitable. Yes, the destruction is inevitable. The Assyrians are going to come in and they're going to ransack the northern kingdom. But the story isn't over. And there was a quote in one of the commentaries I was reading, and he said, I really liked it, so I'm going to read it off my notes. He said, the suffering is not the end of the story. It's not the end of the relationship, and not the end of the people. So it's not the end of their relationship with God. It's not the end of them being his people. It's just going to look different, and there's going to be restoration at the end. So I don't know about you, but studying Amos this closely has been fascinating, especially coming on the heels of our study of 1st and 2nd Kings. We're going to continue on looking through the book of the 12. And I believe we're going to look at Jonah next week. I love Jonah. It's super fun. book to read. So I'm looking forward to it. I hope you'll join me then. Bye!